ready to talk anytime they'd like to talk. But they have to come to the table, and they have to come to the table with a view that they do want to make a different choice.
A softer tone today from the U.S. on North Korea. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says he's now willing to enter talks with no preconditions. It comes 2 weeks after North Korea test-fired its 20th missile this year, which flew higher and farther than any previous one. Military experts say those missiles could potentially carry a nuclear warhead to the United States. Tillerson's remarks are a departure from the fire and fury threats out of President Trump's office. So, can diplomacy solve this crisis? Earlier this week, I spoke with Christine Ahn, the founder of Women Cross DMZ. Joining me now is the founder of Women Cross DMZ, Christine Ahn. So what advice are you giving the Canadian government, other officials that you're speaking to today?
I'd say the most important moment for Canada right now is its feminist foreign policy that it just announced and allocated $17 million for over the next 5 years to really put it to work, give it some legs. And it's convening a meeting in Vancouver of countries that were sending nations to the UN command. And why not include women? The evidence is in that when women peacemakers are involved in the peace-building process, in 39 of the 40 major conflicts from around the world, when women were involved, it led to a peace agreement. And when women were involved in drafting the actual peace agreement, they had a greater chance of sustaining.
I take your point sort of writ large about wanting to get women involved, but how is that useful in the context of the current challenges, I'll call them, with North Korea?
Well, I would say that the foreign ministers that will gather next month probably have never been to North Korea, probably have never met a North Korean person. And I think that there is so much misinformation about North Korea, and to actually engage and to include people. I mean, obviously North Korea will not be invited. But
give me an example of that misinformation.
I would say that they're all brainwashed, or that they don't have their own opinions, that they're just mouthpieces of the government, that they don't have ideas, or that they're open, or that there are changes taking place in North Korea. I think it's really important to actually go and visit the country and to actually speak to North Korean people about changes that are taking place in the country, because we tend to have from the West a very static view about North Korea. And I think that the people that we met with today were very responsive, that they see the kind of political moment for Canada, not just because of this feminist foreign policy, but because Canada has this really great track record, especially with regards to the U.S., its closest neighbor, and Cuba, the kind of quiet back channel diplomacy that it did to kind of foster the normalization of relations. I think it could play that role between the U.S. and DPRK.
Yeah, well, so I want to dig into that. It's one thing to think about the role of women, to bring women to the table, think about how women are affected, but concrete actions, you could see us as an interlocutor, essentially?
Absolutely. I mean, Canada has had diplomatic relations with the DPRK since 2010. It's been inactive, but they exist. And I think it's relations with Cuba, and just the kind of, I think the position that Foreign Affairs Minister Freeland had just made, that the importance of South Korea, I think, to be really lifted up in this current conflict. I mean, in the White House, Trump is just picking up the phone and calling China and Japan, but where is South Korea, who is a strong ally and who has said, we need to resolve this problem diplomatically?
I can understand the desire to get people, particularly in the region, involved in the conversation, but in terms of the actions that are actually required to bring the tension down a bit. I mean, when we think of both what we hear out of North Korea and what we hear from Donald Trump, I know you don't think that sanctions are necessarily the way to go. What do we do to actually get those two countries to bring down the temperature?
Well, I think there's concrete proposals on the table. One is obviously the freeze for freeze. That North Korea had agreed to in 2015 to stop its missile and nuclear testing, and the U.S. and South Korea would halt or scale back its military war drills, which the North Koreans view as very provocative. I mean, they do include such things as decapitation strikes against the regime. So imagine, I mean, from a Canadian perspective or even from a U.S. perspective, if, say, Russia was conducting war drills with Cuba, simulating an invasion of Washington, D.C., I don't think that Americans would sit well with that. And so I think we need to, that's why it's so important to hear from the North Koreans' point of view and why they believe that those war drills are so provocative and dangerous. And so that's one thing. And I think another thing that we requested of the Canadian government was to really take a position on a no first strike. We've heard military officials, especially Secretary Perry, the former U.S. Defense Secretary under the Clinton administration, that negotiated successfully a freeze of North Korea's nuclear program, that said North Korea is not going to conduct a first strike on us. And so I think that would be an important message to send to the North Koreans. We are not about doing regime change. We truly want to resolve this diplomatically. I think that will really bring the temperature down and allow space for dialogue to happen.
I do want to push back for a moment because one of the criticisms that your group has faced when you crossed the DMZ and since is that you are that you go too easy on the North Korean regime, that you're not critical enough of the things that they are doing, the human rights abuses in that country, the starvation that people are facing. What do you say to that?
Oh, I think that's absolutely incorrect. I mean, we want to engage. And the way that I view the human rights crisis in North Korea is part of a broader problem of the unresolved war. And what we know is that through engagement, through dialogue, through citizen diplomacy and engagement, I mean, look at the case of China. They have had a pretty horrific human rights record as well. But what has improved the situation? Certainly the economic development of that country has obviously improved the day-to-day life. But through engagement, through being part of the international community, they have been more responsive. And I think the great news in this critical moment is the Undersecretary General of the UN going to North Korea and coming back and saying, we have negotiated an agreement to have regular dialogue with North Korea, but this is a critical moment, and time is running out for there to be a diplomatic breakthrough. So in terms of human rights, what is going to improve the human rights of the North Korean people? By completely destroying that country and bombing it to bits again, as we did in the 1950 to 53 Korean War, or actually engaging, lifting sanctions that are having deleterious impacts on the people. And these aren't smart sanctions anymore. The UN Security Council sanctions now are targeting the economy, and especially industries that employ women. I mean, there is a grassroots marketization movement taking place in North Korea. And the further we isolate them, that is basically quashing that.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Catherine, for having me.